The Airline Business Podcast is sponsored by Panasonic Avionics. Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, industry recovery is still on track, but airlines wrestle with sustainability challenge. My name's Graham Dunn, Executive Editor at Flight Global, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yeah, good. Even after all these years of doing this podcast, I still don't remember whether I say hello Lewis before you come in or not. You would think, I mean, it's a relatively basic bit of the podcast.
Yeah, you could take that gap out where I was wondering the same thing, but then you're going to have to take all of what we just said out as well, aren't you? So.
Well, I mean, I don't want to give away too many of our trade secrets, but your planning for this podcast has involved pouring a pint of water over yourself minutes before going live.
Well, at the time, I didn't sleep too well last night because of the heat, so yeah, it's certainly woken me up a bit. But fortunately, it missed all of my computer and everything, so hopefully we won't suddenly crash in the middle of this. But there's a nice start to the podcast anyway, so it's the only way is up, maybe.
Definitely so. So for this podcast, this is the first podcast we've done since the IATA AGM in Dubai a couple of weeks ago, which is obviously the big sort of meeting point for the year for airline CEOs, and it's sort of a real opportunity to sort of give a sense check for where the industry is, both in its short-term recovery, longer-term recovery, and longer-term challenges. And on the one hand, I think my introduction, which was recovery on track, sustainability still a challenge, is something we could have introduced every podcast for the last 2 to 3 years with. But I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing, but that sort of was probably my big takeaway from this IATA and this AGM, was that actually the themes, it was a bit more of a business as usual, but almost a business as usual in a good way.
Yeah, precisely. Same as you. I think as journalists, maybe we've been spoilt a bit the last couple where there were still strong narratives, whether it was around recovery from the pandemic or China to open up, and then the headwinds that were still being faced last year, etc. And it felt this one was sort of maybe dull's too strong a word, but I mean that in exactly the business as usual way. We were kind of there weren't the big blockbuster stories where what are they saying about this? What are they saying about this? It's kind of quite, as you say, business as usual topics, whether that's around the cost environment, the profitability, as you say, the sustainability challenge, which I think the narrative is pretty much set for at least the next 5 years, really, as we head towards 2030 targets. So yeah, from that point of view, I think business as usual, as you say, in a fairly positive way, in the sense that they upgraded the profit outlook for this year, so that it's a slight improvement on last year now. For the global industry, I think all regions are said to be profitable, albeit with pretty thin margins in some cases this year.
What's always interesting, IATA for some time has they came up with this quite snappy element that the industry as a whole, the kind of the profit margins it makes on this multi-billion industry, I guess, and the individual airlines are making about the price of a coffee in terms of their operating margin on every ticket they sell. And aside from the fact that the coffee analogy continues to work as inflation has lifted the price of coffee in
yeah, that's the danger. For £10 a ticket doesn't sound too bad to me. Anyway, no.
but there is an element, because whenever you're looking at these forecasts or this environment, and especially a period like with this one, where, as I say, the IATA's forecast was, they notched up the industry profit forecast for this year by, I think, 3 or 4 billion collectively. That's on top of a slightly better 2023 than they originally projected, and that sort of is quite easy to view that as it's a bit so-so, it's a bit kind of bit whatever. But then, of course, you have to remember that a year or so ago you had the fears of inflation and what that's going to do. There's much more around, how long will revenge travel work? You had the continuing impact around Ukraine. You had a lot of, I think the economic projections in particular, there were a lot of unknowns in where things were going. And to some extent that it's been relatively benign. And we can talk a bit about, and we have done, but we can talk about how actually whether we are seeing a bit of a normalisation of travel demand from those post-pandemic revenge travel highs. But as a general rule, a lot of the fears around the economy haven't come to pass. And IATA's chief economist Marie Owens-Thompson was flagging again this very unusual element with, despite all these economic challenges, that employment remains high. We are seeing, rather than a jobless recovery, we're almost in a fully employed semi-recession, not quite recession, but slow paced recovery. But there is, the plus side for airlines on this is that people being employed is, and this is the point she was making, actually for the airline industry, it is better to have more people employed and slower overall economic growth than sort of gangbuster growth with less people fully employed and able to travel. And she had some very interesting views actually and thoughts about actually as we've moved to more of a service economy, and that generally makes for a slightly less slump and boom style economy, which for airlines would be absolutely wonderful, because it's the shocks that hurt them.
Yeah, precisely. As you say, certainly when you look at GDP figures and how the economy, the fears that there were a year ago, as you say, have not played out, and there are a lot of people who still have spending power, even if inflation has knocked that power a bit, as you say, because so many people are employed. Just broadly, that means there are more people than perhaps would have been expected in the pre-COVID time who have got jobs and still able to pay to travel. Yeah, the broad theme around revenge travel, I think a few CEOs we spoke to did say that bit's over now. I think quite a few CEOs in the US would have been able to tell you that probably about a year ago or more. But that said, I think obviously the other thing that is supporting the industry is the continued capacity constraints. So if you think about what actually looks different in the industry coming out of COVID versus some of the big things going into it, an obvious one is that there was a constant concern about overcapacity pre-COVID, and at the moment, obviously, if you've got capacity and you're flying it, it's in a lot of markets, it's relatively easy to fill those aircraft up, and that's supporting yield and etc. So that kind of much better than expected economic situation is again a backdrop that was unexpected, particularly a couple of years ago. I think when we were in Doha, and there were so many headwinds at that point. It was hard to know which ones to focus on. And I think, as you say, in most cases, things haven't turned out as challenging as expected. There are obvious exceptions to that. On the geopolitical side, we know the challenges in the Middle East and the conflict in Ukraine, for example, are particularly challenging for sets of carriers. Do have an impact outside the region. Obviously, we've got the airspace challenges particularly affecting flight times between Europe and Asia, for example. There are factors in play, but broadly, there was a sense that it carries on being a pretty decent environment if you've got the capacity. We know we've talked a lot about, I think, the challenges if you haven't at the moment, getting that capacity is a challenge. And we do know there was a kind of rocky start to the year for a few, particularly the big European airline groups, for example. But I think there's a sense going to summer that things are looking pretty good. And on the topic of premium travel, I think another theme coming out of COVID is that where airlines have lost some of that corporate travel, I think that there has been a structural change in some markets where it's kind of settled down at 60-70% in terms of volume. I think in some cases yields mean that the actual yields are much higher as a proportion of their 2019 levels. But I think a lot of airlines are finding that leisure travellers are picking up the slack where they've lost that corporate travel in premium cabins. So yeah, a broadly positive outlook. I think Scott Kirby said steady as she goes, talking about the outlook at the moment. I think that's probably a pretty good way of describing it for a lot of airlines that we spoke to at the events.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Japan Airlines was an interesting one in terms of Japan's been quite heavily impacted as a market, or as a slightly changed dynamic since the pandemic, partly as a result of that sort of slower reopening which has happened, but also a heavy impact on the currency, where the Japanese yen has depreciated a lot against the US dollar, which has changed the travelling dynamic quite strongly. So you're seeing, it's obviously more expensive for Japanese consumers to travel abroad. So there's, a bit of a shift to domestic leisure. But, the flip side of it is this international inbound demand is really strong. And so whilst corporate has probably hits a bit of a limit in terms of its restoration, you're seeing some markets where that leisure market is filling it in, and there's strong demand for travel of various types. So you always see these different factors at play. The other thing which has affected Japan Airlines, but a lot of airlines, which had strong traffic to China, and obviously I think that has probably been one of the themes of this first half of the year, and certainly some of the narrative we've seen over the last couple of months is a slight airlines sort of coming to terms with that the capacity international capacity at least isn't going to come back to China as quickly as maybe they had hoped.
Yeah, and that again has been a thing we've seen over really probably a year now. We obviously had the initial reopening as 2023 started, and I think there's a sense has built up over that time. You got the initial kind of surge back, but it's really plateaued at a level that is a long way off, I think, pre-COVID levels in a lot of cases. Qantas were there, their CEO Vanessa Hudson, talking about how they dropped their only mainland China flight recently. Yeah, it's entirely a demand thing that they're putting the capacity in, and load factor is sort of 50-60%, I think. So yeah, it's just not viable when they fly into Hong Kong, so there's connections from there. And yeah, I guess it's something everyone's adjusting to, whether that's the international carriers. We know some of the impacts that's having. So Air New Zealand, for example, note that US carriers, because particularly because of some of the geopolitical tensions, I think, between China and the US, that connectivity is a long way off where it was, and as a result, US carriers are flying different routes into Asia and beyond, and that creating putting extra capacity into markets where, like New Zealand, which is having an impact on some carriers. So yeah, that dynamic is one that isn't new, but it is one of the big talking points, I think. It's hard to pin anyone down. I mean, no one wants to say it's structural at this point, but it's difficult to escape the conclusion that just as we've seen corporate travel kind of settle down at a slightly different level in some markets, when you combine it with the airspace challenges in Europe, making it expensive and more timely to fly, for example, between Europe and Asia, that there are a number of factors that, when combined with the reasons for China outbound being a bit weak, economic challenges in China, for example, the geopolitical challenges, the push on domestic travel, all these things mean that I don't think anyone's banking on a really, really strong return from China, certainly this year. I think some things would need to change for that to happen. You would need probably that tension between the US and China to lessen, that kind of thing. So yeah, one of those things that sort of like the MRO challenges we're seeing, for example, where everyone knows about it and everyone's adapting to it. And again, because we're in a capacity constrained environment, while it does create challenges for some airlines, some of the international carriers are shifting capacity into other markets and not China. Broadly, the environment isn't one where there's massive danger of overcapacity in many markets at the moment. So, and what that does mean is it's a growth opportunity that still exists as everyone kind of adapts to it. At some point it might come back, but anyone's banking on that. But if it did, clearly, as ever with China, and I think while this dynamic is new, I think pre-COVID we all know that particularly there was a lot of chat about the secondary airports in China and international carriers trying to make them work, but it's not being able to in all cases, and it being a market awash with potential. And I think on that topic, of course, India, and we know the next IATA AGM will be in Delhi, and I think Indigo are obviously hosting that. I think you look at China's struggles, but it feels like India is kind of well, certainly narrative-wise at the moment, is the other end of the spectrum where people sort of can't get enough of it in a way. I don't know whether this will be the high point, whether it sort of feels like because there's so much potential there and the carriers historically have struggled to take advantage of that, and now there's a couple of sensible operators that are starting to, and maybe this is the easy bit. But Peter Elbers, he was on pretty bullish form, wasn't he, during the AGM?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, he spent sort of an entire day, I think, doing media briefings. But by the time the one I went to, I think he was a bit exhausted of talking through the story. But it's an extraordinary growth thing. And of course, I think what Indigo have been careful about is because actually they, as we talked about in the last podcast, we've seen this evolution of them to becoming more akin to a big airline group in terms of the wide body operations that they're going to start when they start getting their A350s, the introduction of business class, they're stepping into cargo, covering off all those bases. And I think what was particularly interesting, and I think Peter Elbers was kind of central to the message, which is what you'd expect really, because the question is of course that do you risk stepping away from what you do fundamentally well, which in Indigo's case is this proven highly successful low cost model, a short haul network, low cost operator, it's done extremely well. And Elbers was sort of keen to point out that is still fundamentally the core. That is still going to be the growth. That is still where the predominance of the business comes from. Especially from our side, I think it's interesting to focus a little bit on the wide body aircraft, but that's probably going to be less than 10% of their fleet, and even less than that in terms of passenger numbers. So, but definitely an interesting story, and it's just a story that's going to continue to grow. And you definitely sense that Indigo feels that this is the opportunity, it's a chance now to step into so many markets, and some of the reasons it's looking to do that is because of the weakness in that market, whether that be in cargo or long haul, because there's been a struggle in terms of having an Indian carriers really exploiting that opportunity. So, if they don't do it, it'll be international carriers, it'll be the Gulf carriers, it'll be lots of other carriers will step into that market. So, I think it's definitely a question of timing. When we're talking about timing, I think the other thing we should, without and again, this isn't a new dynamic at all, is sustainability. We've known about the target, the challenge, net zero by 2050. And in many ways, we're in the kind of the crunch hard work, aren't we? Which, it's almost the boring part of how do you make it happen? And obviously we know about SAF, and we know that the role that the industry kind of needs it to play and is banking on it to play. And, it's not a new message that the industry is putting out there that, it needs to be supported by governments and states, and it needs to be incentivized to basically have the energy transition we've seen elsewhere. But I guess quite a lot of the focus was on sort of understandably that near term of how you get to SAF, partly because, we are seeing mandates coming in, and the first of the mandates to be using SAF start coming in Europe next year, and those initial targets for around 2030 start kicking in. And I think that was quite a key. That felt like it was probably the key topic of the AGM.
I think, yeah, and I suppose the reason for that is we are now in the sort of time zone where if you can't see how things are going to ramp up quickly at this point, a couple of years ago there was probably still time for things to start happening, and if they're not at this point, then 2030 is not long away, given the time it takes to build that production capacity. So yeah, I do think it's a topic that is not going to go away, until we're at the point where I think a lot of stakeholders believe that whatever happens over the next 3, 4, 5 years going up to 2030, I think broadly most people think that some regions will reach the sort of 5% aspirational target that ICAO agreed, but as a global industry, that's not probably going to be possible. I think some regions, Africa, Latin America particularly, are going to struggle to meet that. But there is some optimism based on trends previously with energy transitions that once growth kicks in terms of SAF production, it will be kind of exponential growth, and that will kick in, maybe in the early 2030s, whatever. And Scott Kirby even went, United CEO, even went as far to say that he believes industry could be way over 100%, SAF supply by the time we get to 2050. So let's park the fact we could have another discussion about whether SAF delivers enough for the industry. I think there is a slight danger on with such focus on SAF that you kind of forget that it's not, it's not a silver bullet. I think Virgin's 100% SAF, right? Zoda, what is it, 60% emissions reduction, whatever, but life cycle, but there's still emissions involved. There are still big questions around where you get that SAF from, clearly, and this is coming into lots of the things that have been discussed at the AGM. There are other challenges, like Brazil is one of the biggest biofuel producers in the world, but none of that goes into producing aviation fuel. So there's airlines and the wider aviation sector has a job to do to perhaps convince governments, regulators, they should be the priority in some cases. Arguably producing biofuel for cars, for example. Automobiles have a electrification as an option, and that has been starting to happen quite significantly in some regions. So perhaps there is a logic to saying aviation should be the priority. But there are many challenges there, and as you say, it's really, we're getting to the point now, and it did get a bit heated at times. There was a bit of disagreement over who was asking for what when it came to ICAO with the 5% target for 2030. So Willie Walsh very firmly saying that IATA didn't ask for that. It's probably a bit around semantics. I think we're getting into that. I mean, ultimately, everyone's in a position where there needs to be carrots and sticks. So, but no one wants those the negative ones to affect them. So, clearly in the airline industry's interest that the governments engage and say, yes, we believe we should get to 5% SAF by 2030. But for the airline industry, that's great in terms of encouraging them to get on with it and regulate and support the production. But in the same way, airlines are looking at that saying, well, that's great. But if it costs what it does now, and we are mandated to buy 5% of our fuel, and it's 5 times the cost of jet fuel, for example, then that's going to be pretty ruinous to our bottom line. So we're in there's a bit of a sort of a standoff. Maybe that's too strong a term, but it's certainly it's sometimes difficult to keep up over who's asking for what and for what reason. I do think broadly everyone's aiming for the same thing, clearly. I just think there are a few hurdles to get over where there's going to be some interesting dynamics over the coming years. One interesting thing I did hear on one of the panel debates was an energy producer saying that their SAF production into Europe is not fully purchased, which is just interesting hearing these things, because obviously we get the airlines will constantly say they're buying everything they can, but I think that and while that may just be because of short-term factors and clearly cost, I think would be a big part of it, but it perhaps is a kind of sign of what could be to come, because there is going to be a point, as I say, where it does start to show up on the bottom line. If it's 0.1% of your fuel usage and it's 5 times as much as jet fuel, then fine. But if it's getting up to 1-2%, 3%, and it's that much, then airlines are going to face challenges. And the industry does admit that this is probably going to push ticket prices up to an extent. So I think we are entering a really interesting time where things actually have to happen. I think we, earlier in the decade, it was sort of easy to talk about everything in theory and to come up with these net zero targets and everything, and that was important. But we kind of then had a bit of a honeymoon where everyone basked in that. But now, so the realities are hitting home. So I think when we look at IATA AGMs into the future, and going to India, where Indigo has 1,000 aircraft on order, it really brings it into sharp focus. Really, what to get to net zero while we're going back to historical growth trends and maybe beyond in some regions. It's going to be a challenge, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely so. So if we've been talking about some familiar themes in the first half of this podcast, get ready for some more familiar themes for the second half, as we are going to revisit our favourite topic of airline consolidation.
Hello listeners, I'm Andy Mason and I want to introduce you to Beyond Entertainment, a new podcast from Panasonic Avionics. Each week, we sit down with the best and brightest in our industry for a quick chat on the future of passenger experience. Everything from display and audio technology to in-flight Wi-Fi and killer digital content to meaningful market research. We're looking at what's now, what's new, and what's next. So join us as we explore the passenger experience. Go beyond entertainment. Available now on your favorite podcasting platforms or on our website, panasonic.aero/beyond entertainment.
So welcome back. As threatened, we are going to talk about airline consolidation, of which there's been a few more moves. But before we do, we should flag, of course, as we will flag in every podcast from now on, we have a new shiny airline business website, which you can read much more of the coverage we've been talking about, an analysis from the IATA AGM, amongst other things, and the various interviews that we did across that event, which included updates with the likes of Indigo, Qantas, Flyer Deal, KLM, Lufthansa, well, many more in there. But Lewis, as we're sort of preparing for the next results season, I mean, one of the fundamental aims of this website is to sort of track the business of airlines, which we did in the first quarter. What's it looking like?
Yeah, so obviously the website has individual airline data, but yeah, we aggregate some benchmark carriers from each region. I think the first quarter, a couple of interesting things stood out. I think Asia Pacific, you really see the sort of year on year how, while we talk about COVID being in the rearview mirror in many cases, its impact is certainly showing through year on year. So RPKs, as in traffic with our benchmark Asia Pacific Airlines in the first quarter, they were up 39%. So yeah, you can see there they are not organic growth trends. These are big recoveries. Obviously, the comeback of China has a lot to say there. Capacity up 30%, load factor up 5 points. That's a massive change. We know in usual times, if such things exist, there you're looking at very tiny changes really, in certainly on load factor generally. So yeah, while we like to think we're all looking forward, I think there's recovery happening there, and in all of the markets really. I think particularly because of Asia slow comeback, that does filter through in some of the figures. Just point out a couple of other interesting things in Q1. If you go onto the website, and you can do a free 2-week trial, but you'll see from our tracking benchmarks for the Q1 that most of the figures are green, which indicates improvements year on year. But the profitability in North America and Europe are the only two red figures there, which means they were down year on year. They were both loss-making in the first quarter of 23, but that loss deepened in the first quarter of 24. We know there were, in some cases, kind of temporary factors that played into that, and you can read our analysis of that in our quarterly reports. But I think something to watch out for really is how much those two regions in particular are starting to turn around in the April to June period, particularly as obviously we're heading into the real peak period for travel where airlines make their money. So yeah, lots of trends to look out for, loads of data for you to track and enjoy on the site. So I'd just recommend everyone sign up for their 2-week trial if they haven't done already, and drop us a note if you have any observations, or mainly praise. I think that's what we're looking out for.
That's what we're looking for. And you can find that at, of course, flightglobal.com/airline-business. So airline consolidation. Now, we talked a lot about this, partly because it takes it's endlessly long to get deals over the line, and in many cases not to get them over the line. It's starting to look as though, certainly Carsten Spohr, Lufthansa chief executive, was confident. I suppose that doesn't necessarily say anything, because he has always said he is confident and optimistic about ITA being approved. There seems some signs. I don't think a decision will come in between us recording, editing, and publishing this podcast, but you can never rule these things out. But the decision on that is expected by 4th of July, and the indications are that will be a positive ruling. And there are some signs similarly for IAG and Air Europa, and this is very much, securing the regulatory clearance is attached to the concessions that will be airlines will give up. And, this is the constant element of getting these deals over the line is, what price are the airlines being asked to pay, and do they think it's worth paying that price in terms of what they give up? I think what's interesting, we focused a lot in what we talk about around accomplishing those deals. Giving up of slots does create opportunities for potential other players. And regarding IAG and Air Europa, there was some quite interesting news in the past few days of a potential operation that could come out depending on what remedies are offered up.
Yeah, it's a bit out of the blue, really. I mean, we knew Volotea, I think they call themselves an ultra low cost carrier based in Spain, but operations in several countries in Europe, really. I think they've only actually got a couple of bases in Spain. But their kind of business model is around connecting sort of thin leisure and VFR routes between airports where generally they're smaller airports where in most cases, and I think more than 50% of the cases, there's no competition on the route. I know that they were talking to the European Commission when IAG first made its move to buy Air Europa. And what came about this week was kind of an answer to a question I've been kind of thinking about a lot and wondering a lot is who is actually positioned to pick up remedies at Madrid, where Iberia and Air Europa are by far the biggest carriers. Iberia in first place, Air Europa second, particularly when you look at connectivity to the Americas and Latin America in particular, which is obviously a massive market in Spain. Those two virtually, in terms of local carriers, apart from a few dozen flights from Iberostar and World to fly their point-to-point services, pretty much got the entire market in terms of local carriers. So it kind of needed something new to happen, I think, to have a solution that could certainly pick up remedies in a way that replicated maybe some of the hub sort of function that Iberia and the Air Europa were operating with their long haul and short haul fleets. So yeah, really interesting sort of combination came up this week. So Volotea and Abra Group, which owns Avianca, the Colombian carrier, and Gol, the Brazilian carrier that's currently in Chapter 11, they have joined forces with a memorandum of understanding to create a joint venture to take up some of those remedies. And essentially the idea is that Volotea would become the feeder airline at Madrid for Avianca flights to Latin America. That would be a new thing for Volotea. As I say, they're not flying into any hubs. They do fly into Athens, I think, is their biggest airport. But as a general rule, this is a bit of a shift for them if it happens. They're talking about moving 20 aircraft into Madrid. At the moment, Avianca connects about 3 destinations, I think, in Colombia. It's got an El Salvador service as well, launching for the summer season. So there'd be more frequencies involved there, I think, if they pick up the slots from the remedies. And basically, that joint venture would serve 5 to 7 million people a year, they reckon. Yeah, so you'd have Volotea as the low-cost carrier feeding in to Madrid, and Avianca and potentially other Abra Group carriers, but I think Avianca is the kind of the main player there, is then flying people into Latin America. And obviously then on from its points in Latin America, it connects across the Americas. So, and I spoke to the CEOs of both airlines this week. Both of them are really keen to point out that the Madrid market is about 60% Latin America origin on flights to and from that region. So, having a carrier flying in that has that connectivity within Latin America, they see as a really strong point, because if you're just flying point to point from Madrid to Latin America, you won't be getting that feed into the flights back to Madrid or on from the destinations in Latin America to other places in the Americas. So yeah, that it's a new thing for both. Their networks don't overlap at the moment, so Volotea doesn't serve Madrid, so it would be a big change for them. But they seem pretty confident on it, and it's certainly an interesting one. They've been talking to the Commission, they say, so, and there's clearly a level of remedy that needs to be awarded to make this work. We all know that scale is so important with a hub type operation. I think there's a recognition that if other carriers get too many of the remedies, then this just isn't going to be able to happen. So, and I think they're very open saying that because they obviously want the Commission to hear that. So yeah, a really interesting one, and not one I'd imagined happening, but hearing them talking about it, it's certainly on paper and it makes a lot of sense. And they are two established players in their respective markets. So I can imagine the regulators see some attractiveness there, certainly, as well, as they kept emphasising to me. This is about a full hub solution, a new hub solution for Madrid.
I find it interesting. Volotea are a very intriguing airline. Carlos Munez, the man behind it, was involved in the very early startup of Welling as well. He's been in that industry and has, been very effective actually in developing a model which doesn't necessarily get a lot of headlines. Really, actually, it's a kind of, as you say, they are an ultra low cost carrier, but they're kind of somewhere between an old fashioned regional carrier and a low cost operator, and they do sort of operate in the shadows a little bit. So it's quite interesting to see. It would be interesting to see them flying out of Madrid. And I think as well, you've also then, through the Abra group, obviously Avianca. Abra, we've no idea what's quite going to happen with Gol, which is obviously in a restructuring process at the moment. But Avianca, which went through its own restructuring, again, a very interesting carrier, and it's been shown a lot of flexibility. I think journalists, we always like to call airlines something one way or other. We like to pigeonhole them. I think they still are a network carrier, but they are a point-to-point carrier and a low-cost carrier as well. So, I think what's quite interesting, at least certainly from a journalistic perspective, it does bring together some new interesting carriers doing something new and different.
Yeah, you're right. There is almost an argument that, we talked about Volotea. This is shifting away from its model. There is almost an argument that Avianca's been through a change, which, as you say, was switching more towards point-to-point and away from being that traditional network carrier. With this move, as with Volotea, this is kind of a shift in it towards something a bit more like their old model, and it all being about the hub rather than the point-to-point, etc. So, but it is flexibility. And Adrian Newhouser, the Abra CEO, who until quite recently was Avianca's CEO, made the point that's what he likes with Carlos Munoz and Volotea, is they're not tied to a particular model. They let the market dictate what they need to do in particular markets, and in this case they just see the opportunity and they're going for it. So yeah, it's not about we're an ultra low cost carrier, we're a hybrid low cost carrier, whatever, therefore that's what we do. It's kind of about adapting to that market in this case. So it's interesting from that point of view as well. And it is, I think, when you talk about going back to what you were talking about in the first half with Indigo, with the kind of model flexibility, and it may be a bit of a cliche. No, we always, as you said, journalists want to pigeonhole the airlines, and it's this fairly common question in interviews. Do you still see yourself as a low cost carrier? You've got a frequent flyer scheme now. Yeah, you've got these sort of semi-business class seats up front, whatever. But the reality is everyone's seeing market opportunities and adapting their models as it happens. I think the labels are still useful in some cases, but I think it goes to show that when opportunities come up, there's going to be interest. Volotea, Carlos Munoz was keen to point out as well that they do show flexibility in their model already. They operate a shuttle service for Airbus. They do some PSO routes, as you say, which is where they're sort of transcending the low cost and more regional carrier model. They work with tour providers as well, so there's some complexity that they've allowed to creep into the business that for some low cost carriers wouldn't happen. So it's all about the flexibility of the models there, and it'd be really interesting to see. There's obviously a lot that needs to happen for this to take place. So, and first and foremost, the Commission needs to allow IAG to purchase Air Europa, and then this joint venture needs to be handed enough remedies to make this work. I did ask what happens if you don't get the remedies, and they probably gave the answer they have to give, which is that they'll still look to work together, but at the moment their networks don't overlap, so that's not an obvious way in which that might happen. But I did also ask if this is a precursor to Abra Group potentially making an investment into Volotea, and again they gave the answer you'd expect. Really, it's not. They didn't flat out say that's not going to happen, and they certainly seemed quite happy about the prospect of working with each other. So a sort of a different angle on the whole consolidation thing there. And for a while, it was difficult to see how those two massive carriers joining forces at Madrid would be able to get over the line from a regulatory perspective. It's harder, I guess, to argue that there's enough competition there if you literally can't see it. I guess now there's a sort of a solution, certainly to the hub function potentially in place. You can see much more clearly how that might get over the line.
Yeah, and just one last one, another watch this space, I guess, is we've seen reports in the Australian Financial Review and the rest of the Australian media around a possible move by Qatar Airways to take a stake in Virgin Australia, maybe a 20% stake. And I mean, that would be really interesting. Australia is a key market for Qatar Airways, and it's a slightly complex one for them. They struggle to get access to that market, and it's a sort of slightly role reversal in many ways, in that their most obvious bedfellow and partner there would be Qantas, as they're both members of OneWorld, but of course Qantas has a wide-ranging relationship with Emirates across the Middle East. So Qatar has to look for other ways in there, and a combination already code shares for Virgin Australia, and a combination further tightening or an investment, a strategic investment in Virgin Australia would be interesting. I find it interesting because it kind of resurrects, I suppose, two long-standing themes, which are that Qatar has invested in a number of carriers. I've kind of lost track as to. It did occur to me that this is an article I probably need to write at some point, but I'm aware of all the investments that the airlines made prior to the pandemic, but with various restructurings and recapitalizations post-pandemic, I've kind of lost track of exactly how live and current those stakes still are. But Qatar, of course, has investments in a number of airlines, and then Virgin Australia, before it went into administration and got bought by Bain Capital. But before that, it was kind of a lightning rod for airline investments. So Air New Zealand and Singapore Airlines and Etihad, at one stage as part of its cross-equity alliance, and then Henan Airlines, which again was also highly acquisitive, and all of those have been shareholders in that airline. So it's quite interesting to see if that one comes to fruition.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, keeping track of where Qatar Airways are, the other thing to look out for is developments on their Rwanda investment. I think Rwanda's CEO, Yvonne Makolo, did say recently that that's close to going over the line. The only thing I would say is I spoke to her about 2 years ago, and I think she gave a very similar comment then. Clearly, with the pandemic and everything, there's been a lot of reasons why that may have been delayed. But again, that will be really interesting, seeing Qatar Airways take a big stake in Rwanda. I think they've already got an interest in the airport there, and as we know well, and as was talked about quite a lot at the IATA AGM, Africa is awash with potential, and Rwanda is kind of, we don't get data on financials or anything from them, but certainly from they seem a relatively stable and operator there with a foundation. They're not big, I think it's 12, 14 aircraft or something, but with Qatar Airways involved, again, it's an opportunity really, because there are big gaps in the African market for some bigger hub players to come through there. Clearly, a single African sky would be a very helpful development, and there was some talk at the IATA AGM about that being closer maybe than it has been in the past. But we all know, I think, well in Europe, how those sorts of discussions go on and on. But yeah, certainly, again, really interesting to see if Qatar Airways does finally get that Rwanda investment over the line. What happens there? Their CEO did talk about that it was on the verge of completing an investment in a Southern African carrier. I think he said that the recent Qatar Economic Forum, it's not clear whether that refers to Rwanda, so it could get even more interesting in Africa if not. I mean, I could think of a couple of airlines in South Africa, or Southern Africa, I should say. I mean South Africa that might need a bit of help, but yeah, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens over the coming months. But yeah, lots around the world really to look out for there. And we can do loads more podcasts on consolidation, which everyone will love, I'm sure.
Absolutely. We definitely will definitely be consolidation. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Lewis. I think dousing yourself in a pint of water pre-podcast hasn't had any dampening effect on your performance.
No, I don't think it has. I just need to walk outside now and hope that it's still about 30 degrees like it was yesterday, so I'll be dried off in no time.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time again. So that's all we have time for. Our thanks again to Panasonic Avionics for sponsoring the podcast. Do give the Beyond Entertainment podcast a listen. Reminder, you can catch up on all the news and stories we mentioned in this podcast at flightglobal.com/airline-business. You go to the site, get yourself a free 2-week trial to look at all our lovely content on there. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please like and review us. Don't forget to subscribe to get new episodes in your podcast feeds directly. And we'll see you again next time.